Samsung's S20 line has two phones with two different camera configurations, so I just had to include both in this round of Last Cam Standing. That means the S20 Plus and the S20 Ultra take on the champion iPhone 11 Pro, as well as the Pixel 4. Samsung has a 50-50 chance of winning in this unique episode. Last Cam Standing is my long-running smartphone camera testing series that pits the top phones against each other in a head-to-head battle. The goal of this video is simple. I'm trying to find out which of these phones can take the best photos in auto mode with the main lens. Each company tunes its hardware and software in specific ways, and I want to see what they think makes a great photo. Today I'll be breaking the results into three categories: color, clarity, and exposure. Along the way, we'll learn a lot about how these cameras perform, and at the end, I'll crown a winner. Now let's meet the contestants. First up is the Samsung Galaxy S20 Plus and its 12 megapixel main shooter. This camera module feels like an iteration of past Samsung phones, so we'll see just how upgraded it is. Next up is the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra. Where the S20 Plus feels like an iteration, the S20 Ultra promises to be a game changer. A much larger 108 megapixel sensor should let in more light and provide more detail. After that, we have Apple's iPhone 11 Pro, the winner of the last round of testing. It features solid specs and very even processing, and was a big leap over the iPhone XS that came before it. Last, we have the Pixel 4 from Google. While it didn't keep up with the other contestants last time, it's still one of the top camera systems out there. Let's see how it holds up after plenty of software updates. Before we get to the testing, I want to thank our fabulous model Tara. I put a link to her Instagram in the description below, so please go check out her fantastic work. And be sure to subscribe to Tech Advisor for even more coverage of these phones and many more in the future. Now let's get to the testing. First up is the color category, and here I'm looking for things like color reproduction and white balance accuracy. Now more than ever, I really have to split hairs when looking at the results. Each camera produces close to accurate colors, with the biggest differences coming from white balance readings. This first example is subtle, and you have to focus on things like Tara's gray shirt and the cream wall to notice slight variations. The differences are a little more noticeable against this hanger door. Not only do we see how each camera renders the yellow wall, we can also see how it affects the skin color of the model. Honestly, I was surprised to see how different the S20 Plus was compared to the Ultra. I would have assumed Samsung wanted a more consistent result across its new product line, but I guess the changes to the hardware might be more than I thought. I'm also surprised to see that the Pixel 4 is producing warmer results than usual. In this scene, it's Google's phone that has the warmest concrete. It's the S20 Ultra's phone that leans the coolest and even has a hint of green, especially in Tara's skin tone. But switching over to a scene with predominantly green surroundings, the iPhone cranks the warm tones to 11, a very fascinating trait that showed up in almost every photo we took in this area. It does produce pleasing skin tones, but it wrecks the rest of the scene and is not very accurate, especially when viewed side by side with other cameras. But in all the photos I captured, that is really the only one stumbling block for any of these phones. Of course, the color category always hinges on a bit of personal preference, but to my eye, it was the S20 Plus that has the best balance of all four phones. It's not by a huge margin though, and it mainly came down to the fact that it was the most consistent, and none of its photos were way off base in one way or another. So the color category goes to the Samsung Galaxy S20 Plus. The next category is clarity. Here I'm looking at the sharpness of each camera and how well they stay sharp in various lighting conditions. First, I wanted to look at some long distance shots like this one across the rooftops. I'll remind everyone that the S20 Ultra defaults to pixel binning its 108 megapixel sensor down to 12 megapixels for the best processing results, which is how most people will use it and how I tested it. Zooming in to see the results, it's the two Samsung phones that stand above the rest, with the iPhone keeping the scene pretty soft like usual, and the Pixel 4 having the grainiest version. Switching to an example down this neighborhood street, we notice the most stair-stepping on the power lines in the Pixel 4's shot. But this is a great time to talk about the generous amounts of sharpening Samsung has applied to its results, with a telltale sign showing up as white haloing around the power lines. The sharpening is slightly stronger on the S20 Ultra, but they both have heavy amounts applied to the final image in order to provide that clear pop. Onto a shot that includes Tara, we notice another fault of the S20 Ultra. Ever since the first reviews rolled in, there have been reports of the camera missing focus, and it did crop up in my testing. I will note that we took these photos around mid-March after the first round of patches came through. Over time, it has supposedly improved, but there are still problems here and there. I kept Terra in the same spot and moved in closer to see if Samsung still smoothed over skin like in the past. Surprisingly, it wasn't the case, with both Samsung phones having the most information and texture on her face thanks to the sharpening, but this does accentuate slight blemishes. This time it's the iPhone that has the most glossed over look, which helps hide imperfections, but also takes away some of those fine details. Coming in even closer, I wanted to point out the bokeh quality coming out of the S20 Ultra. Even without zooming in, we can see the amount of blur on the hanger windows behind Terra, and it's thanks to that larger sensor. Now I know that the majority of smartphone users actually prefer everything in the frame to be in focus, but for photographers like me who use things like depth of field as a tool to guide attention, it's a valuable tool and it's surprisingly smooth on the S20 Ultra. Even in this medium shot where most smartphones exhibit very little background blur, the S20 Ultra reproduces some very nice bokeh, which helps add to the depth of the scene and subtly draws your eye towards the subject. Now let's go over some low-light results, returning to the street from earlier. When we zoom in on the cars, we see that the iPhone gives us the softest shot, with noise reduction kicking into high gear. The Pixel 4 produces one of the best shots even though there is a bit of grain present. But unfortunately, the S20 Ultra's larger sensor doesn't help in this example. I was hoping for a sharper image than this. Now I know I said I wasn't going to look at extra modes in this series, but I had to include the night modes because it's on by default with the iPhone. With that in mind, the iPhone jumps ahead and turns in a clearer shot than any other camera, even showing the most information in the tough to see power lines overhead. Both Samsung phones produce a little more detail in this mode, but it's nothing to write home about. The Pixel 4 sees a great boost as well, but also applies a heavy amount of noise reduction. The same results cropped up in all the low-light testing I did. It's the iPhone that stands above the rest, retaining a great amount of detail without too much noise. Like I mentioned, Apple enables its night mode by default without having to be prompted by the user, which I think is actually a smart move since its results speak for themselves and it's very easy to use. So the clarity category ends up being a bit more of a competition than the color category. Samsung's phones are technically the sharpest options in daylight, but rely heavily on post-processing, which comes with its own problems. The iPhone is softer in daylight, but is the best option in low light since its night mode kicks all sorts of butt. And the Pixel isn't a slouch in this department, but it doesn't excel at any one spot. On paper, this category should have been dominated by the S20 Ultra and its crazy 108 megapixel sensor. And for the most part, it turned in great results with plenty of detail and awesome amounts of depth of field to play with. But it also tripped up too many times by either missing focus or showing too many over-sharpening artifacts. So until I can confirm that the autofocus issues have been resolved and Samsung dials back its sharpening, it's just too hard to give it the win. It's the iPhone that is plenty sharp in all scenarios, has the best low light images, and is very consistent in its results. I have to play it safe and give Apple's iPhone 11 Pro the win in the clarity category. The last category is exposure, and here I'm looking for correct exposures and a good balance of dynamic range. Starting on this beach scene, the typical scenario plays out between the different manufacturers. Samsung leans a bit more into a punchier high contrast look, Apple produces flat results that seem dull compared to the rest, and Google continues to underexpose scenes. Apple does have the most dynamic range here, allowing for more flexibility in editing, just like it does with sharpness, but the Samsung images are more interesting right out of the camera. Backing up a bit, we get roughly the same results, but the iPhone is a bit underexposed like the Pixel. Both those phones had plenty of headroom to push the exposure without blowing highlights, and it just ends up lacking punch. The Samsung phones again turn in almost the same result as each other and have the best exposure on Terra, but end up blowing out the clouds again, and that's a bummer. To put a twist on things, let's move to the forest scene, which yields some very interesting results. All the shots are fairly similar except for one key area: the sky. On the iPhone and Pixel's photos, the sky is almost all the way blown out, with only a hint of blue or textured clouds. Compare that to both Samsung photos that showcase a bright blue sky with fluffy clouds. Every example here shows off Samsung's ability to maintain a natural looking sky without having the image feel overprocessed. The fact that they are doing so while keeping a proper exposure on Terra is crazy, and I'm not sure why this type of strong HDR didn't kick in on the beach scene. But just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, I found a couple examples in my testing where the Samsung phones exposed even darker than the Pixel, a rare thing for any phone to do in my experience. It's not wildly off the mark, but it did happen enough to take note of it here, especially when it did so well in the forest. I know most of the testing I do revolves around a model, but I do also take a good amount of scenic photos. The scene optimizer that Samsung uses by default produced horrible shots when the cameras were pointed at flowers, and it was just so bad that I had to include it here. So like the clarity category, there were times where Samsung, specifically the S20 Plus, turned in great shots, but they also had way too many instances that had me scratching my head. At its best, I actually do think that the S20 Plus does strike a best balance between maintaining dynamic range while presenting a pleasing photo with plenty of pop. But I'm not a fan of inconsistent results or consistently underexposed results like what comes out of the Pixel 4. The most consistent shooter here is the Apple iPhone 11 Pro, which wins the exposure category. And with that, it looks like we have a winner of this round, the iPhone 11 Pro. I do have to say that Samsung came damn close and even beat the iPhone in plenty of areas, but Apple gets the prize here based on fantastic results and a consistent user experience. The photos coming out of the iPhone 11 Pro offer pleasing results for novices, but also have room to work with in editing, which is a very hard balance to strike. I appreciate that Apple doesn't push the results too far in one direction and keeps things fairly even, allowing for me to manipulate the image if I want to. And its special mixture of long exposure algorithms provides some of the best low-light photos I've seen out of a smartphone, which is always impressive. Now more than ever, I'm finding it difficult to see sweeping problems in these flagship smartphones, so I've really had to lean into rewarding consistent performance where it makes sense. And in this round of testing, the iPhone 11 Pro takes the cake. So what do you think? Did I sell the Pixel 4 too short? Did I miss some small detail in my results? Sound off in the comments below, but more importantly, hit the subscribe button so you can see more episodes of Last Game Standing here on Tech Advisor.